talking with God about kings and kingdoms. 2 Samuel chapter 8, this week, blown to kingdom come. That's right. Come on in. Let's check it out together.
All the bubbas of the world, we got one mission in mind.
Welcome to the Biblical Channel, where the bubbas of the world meet up with biblical ideas. That's just what we do. We're just trying to get people from bullshitting to the holy shitting to shooting the shitting so that you know it, well, so you know your shit. Well, anywho, we just like to have fun with God. We're concerned that people throughout time always seem to let God's words go. And that is the great sadness of our society, because it is the funnest set of words. It is the most uplifting set of words. God has a tremendous sense of humor, and it really does tap in to our lives in a way that nothing else does. And it is everything that every human being on the planet should want to hear. And it's a story for everybody. It is not, anyhow. Listen, just glad you're here, and we're going to keep moving through. Don't forget the will of God is actually to rejoice always and to pray continually and to give thanks in all circumstances. So no matter what you thought God's will was, that's God's will clearly stated in his own book. So going through his book is what we do. We're up to 2 Samuel chapter 8. And in 2 Samuel chapter 8, I have entitled this, Blown to Kingdom Come, because the kingdom has come and others have been blown away. But I can't help but to tell you, I've been raised on Looney Tunes, throughout my childhood. And every Looney Tune character was always blowing somebody to kingdom come. It was a phrase that I used to hear all the time, blown to kingdom come. You hear it every once in a while, and I still think it's out there. You just don't hear it as much. Perhaps that's because it's been canceled. Who knows? I don't know. I'm not up on all those, cancellations. It's hard to keep track of. But here we are, really, what I would say is the heart of the story so far. It is potentially the climax of the story so far. It is the fulfillment of the promises of God. This kingdom has come, and chapter 8 is dry reading. I'll be the first one to say it's dry reading, but there's a dry sense of humor in it as well. Because what we have in here is just really a basic historical rendering. And it was really funny in the 17 and 1800s, there were some real smart Alecs who were out there, posing or pretending like perhaps all of these places in the Bible were just made up, because nobody was into archaeology until the 1800s. And so some were proposing in the 1700s that this is just a completely made up story. So much to their own chagrin, and a lot of what blew their proposals out of the water was the fact that all of these places, which are so bizarre to us, but basically Syria, that's still around, Egypt's still around, but all of these smaller, kingdoms, Moab, Damascus, that's still a place, but all these kings and their smaller kingdoms and fiefdoms in the Middle East, are largely unheard of, and they're just really not even around anymore. But archaeology, little by little, has found all these places. And so the setting is awfully dry, because it's just involving places and people that we have no connection with. And there doesn't seem to be much going on here, except that there is an awful lot going on here. And let me just point it out to you. So David reigned over all Israel. That is verse 15 in chapter 8 of 2 Samuel. So David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and equity to all his people. Now, again, that doesn't seem like much, but it's actually huge. And to understand the hugeness of it all, you had to be reading the story from the beginning. If you read the story from the beginning and you're familiar with how the story's working, well, then all of a sudden you're like, oh, this is a big moment. This is a huge deal, yada, yada, yada. So anyhow, this idea of the kingdom coming has been lurking and lurching forward in God's great story that he put together. And so let's just do a quick reminder of what that great story is. Number one, Genesis chapter 1 makes a very clear picture for us that we are living in God's place, that God made the place, that he actually made everything, that he's the ruler over everything, and that he made us in an extraordinary way to rule over everything that he has made, that he makes human beings quite different than anything else by putting his image on them. And that means out of his love, he loves making, and he loves making us, and he loves giving all of this to us to rule over. And so there's the opening chapter of God's storyline is creating the setting of just answering that question, where are you? You're in God's world, baby. The question that we have is like, well, how come it doesn't seem like it? It seems like maybe it's Satan's world. It seems like it is a world run amok. It seems like a disappointment because it just doesn't seem like that happy-go-lucky Genesis chapter 1 vibe, where God makes everything. I mean, into the stars, into the planets, all of that. God is the maker of everything, and he makes us in an extraordinary way to actually be the rulers over everything. Well, Genesis chapter 3 gives us an answer as to, why everything is not the way it should be. Not without Genesis chapter 2 making it very clear that marriage is the centerpiece of God's activity in this world. Marriage is God's idea. I can't skip over that. Marriage is so important, man. I just heard of, I was just in church, last weekend, two people celebrating 70 years of marriage. Fantastic. I mean, that is the kind of stuff that stabilizes the world and brings, sanity to this world, is stable marriages. Got to say it. Got to tip my hat to every, long-term marriage that I've ever heard of. I've only got 31 years in, baby. So I'm in nowhere, close to that category. 70 years. Fantastic stuff. Anyhow, Genesis chapter 3 explains to us very clearly why the world is not in that, happy-go-lucky place that Genesis chapter 1 just got done explaining. And that is, well, the Adam and Eve story. And the Adam and Eve story is basically, and by the way, there's a great little series out there called 2 Ways to Live. And my buddy Chris has made this cute little, he had a 3D printer and he put all the 2 Ways to Live pieces, on a little cube. It was very cute. I love it. I keep this thing around all the time. But anyhow, the first part of the cube is this little diagram here that explains that God is the loving ruler of the world who made the world and he made everything. He made us rulers of the world under him. There you go. But, the second part is, why isn't it like that? Well, that's because we all have rejected God's rule simply by trying to live life our own way. When we try to live life our own way without God, it blows everything up. We blow up the kingdom. So the kingdom is not here. The kingdom was intended. God's kingdom was the intention of his creation, but we blew it up. We blew it. We blew that kingdom come. We blew it up. Boom. Blew it up. And God said the most scary words in the planet. He said, I'm going to put you outside the kingdom and I'll let you give it a try yourself. See what you do. That is scary. It is scary when God actually gives us what we say we want, because we're idiots. We just are. If you can't stomach that, well, then you're an idiot. The Bible brings a reality to us that's a lot of fun. If you can stomach the idea that we're all just idiots, that we're all just, strangers, walking through this place, trying to figure it out. We're all looking for answers. And God has just simply given us the answers. And then we have the audacity to say, no, I don't like that. And we have absolutely nothing better to put in its place. That's why I'm here, man. That's why we're here. We're actually going through the story the right way. So Genesis 3 gives us that picture that all is not right in the world because God put us outside the kingdom. And that begins God's story of bringing the kingdom to his creation the way he intended forevermore. And in 2 Samuel chapter 7, God reminds David that he has a forever plan, that David has been an instrumental part of his plan and a fun part of his story. And truly, like I said, this chapter 8 is really the fulfillment of the story coming to its potential completion. So let me explain. Because in Genesis chapter 10, we see that by the time, many years has gone by, and there's absolutely no way to really date the time. those dates in the Bible, those year spans are not meant for us to try to, make a chronology of the age of the earth. That is not, the intention. The intention that God has here is to say that he created, not how he created. But by the time you get to Genesis 10, man outside of the garden has gone wild. And man outside of the garden has, starts to go wild under Cain's rule. Cain, remember, is the guy who killed Abel for no good reason. God is at pains to tell us we live in a world where Cain kills Abel for no good reason. This is the way we are, left to our own devices. And this is the world that we live in. A very clear, succinct summary to help us to understand the pain and the gravity that we face every day. So by the time you get to Genesis 12, God is actually stepping into the world of nations that man is creating. And he says, you know what? I'm going to do a little nation building of my own. And so he picks an unlikely stranger named Abraham. And Abraham's nothing special. And he says, you know what, Abraham? And Abraham's like, what? I wasn't expecting to hear from anybody, let alone the invisible God. And God says, just listen up. I just want you to leave your father and mother's household and follow me. And Abraham says, yes, sir. That is the first bit of good news in the Bible, that mankind is actually capable and designed to respond to God the right way. Abraham just responds to God the right way. So anyhow, when Abraham responds to God the right way, God, makes it clear, Genesis chapter 12, verse 1-3, that God will make a great name for him, that he will make a great nation of him, and he will, create a great land for him. Except that Abraham never sees it. Abraham walks around this land that God promises, but he never sees how it's going to work out. But yet Abraham says, you know what? This is bigger than me. I can see that. And he's content with that. And that's part of the fun of the story. There's something bigger going on. And so when we get to Moses, we find that, the plan is coming together. God rescues the people out of Egypt to make a point that God is the great rescuer of us out of our bondage, not to just slavery, but the slavery to sin, to the slavery of making our own choices without God. And so God's answer to that is, I will build a nation of people. I will build a nation of people. And I will put them in a place, and it'll, in good time, I will defeat the nation that they're going into because they deserve judgment. And God is the only one who gets to decide who deserves judgment and who doesn't. And the Canaanites, are just simply not a great group of people. Child sacrifice, human sacrifices, kind of what they do, how they roll. And that is pretty typical of the ancient world around. This is the world of Cain that has grown up. The world of Cain that has grown up into nations is a group of nations that have made up God on their own terms and are doing some of the most weird and bizarre things. God is setting the record straight through the people of Abraham, through the people of Moses. Moses himself doesn't even make it into the promised land, throws a little hissy fit outside, and God says, I'm not taking you in there. But Moses is okay with that because he sees that God is greater than what's going on right there in front of his nose. But as the story progresses, guess what? They do get into the promised land, and it's not without its troubles. And it's been a troubling story, really up until now. David, the proper king of a kingdom, is now settled, just like God promised to Abraham. So in some ways, we might say the story has ended. In fact, if you were Jewish, and if you're Jewish, and you do read your old part of the Bible that we as Christians call it, then you would see that this, chapter 8, is the high point of the story. There is no greater time in the history of Israel than the time when David, the great king of Israel, and perhaps his son Solomon, but this is the highlight reel. This is the climactic moment. There's never been anybody like David, according to the Jews. And we're the ones who, as Christians, can read the text and see that, oh, wait a minute, something better than David is coming. That's what God told David in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 13, that there is something ahead of you, David, that's coming from your line, a son of yours, that's going to indeed rule over the forever kingdom. So at this point in the story, we, recognize that, God has fulfilled his promise. And this nation, the nation of Israel, has become a nation pretty much the way that other nations become nations. And that is through brute and through might. And the text in our, says several times that it is the Lord who is giving victory to David. It's not necessarily David's great skills or his fighting warriors or anything like that. It is the Lord who gave victory to David wherever he went. Again, that is stated in verse 14 of chapter 8. So God is behind the scenes, and he is the one who is allowing these great victories, but these victories are ugly. And so from a Christian point of view, or perhaps a Christianized point of view, we look back on this text and it seems so rough and seems so brutal. David is going to put, many people to death. But there are going to be people who come, so perhaps, King Toy, of Hamath, represents those who hear and see what God is doing and just come willfully. And that reminds us, too, of Psalm 2. Psalm 2 is a great psalm because it gives the biblical or the God point of view that from God's point of view, the nations are always raging. We're so annoying because we're always raging and we're always plotting in vain against all the kings of the earth are setting themselves against the Lord and his anointed. So we see this in a literal form in the David story that, kings like, Hadazezer are, rebelling against David, and David puts them down, and David puts a lot of people down. A lot of armies go down, and it's God who is doing this. And as Psalm 2 says, God sits in the heavens and he laughs at man's endeavors. He holds us in derision. He will speak to us in his wrath and terrify them in his fury. And as for God, he says, I have set my king on Zion's hill. And he says, I will tell of you a decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you, ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. Now, kings, be wise, be warned, O rulers of the earth, serve the Lord with fear, rejoice in trembling, kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you perish in the way. So, in many ways, this is, Psalm 2's reflection, and as I said before, if you're Jew, then this is kind of the best that it ever was. And I'm not really sure that you could expect a Jew to tell you or give you an explanation as to what they're looking for today. I certainly haven't, and that's okay. There's nothing against that. It's just that this story is begging for an ending. This is not the ending. For us, we know that there's a hint or a foreshadow in chapter 8, verse 13. David made a name for himself. We also know that it's problematic that this kingdom that God has put in the middle of all the kingdoms, as successful as it is under David and Solomon, is just a kingdom like any other kingdom that has arrived through bloodshed. Through the bloodshed of the normal armies, fighting armies, and the bloodshed of just people doing people stuff that we do. And so we have this sense, or we should have this sense, that if this was the true ending, then it wouldn't be very special. There must be something better. And that something better is exactly where the text would have you. Wondering to yourself, when is something even better than David and his kingdom coming? But before we go to that place, let's remind ourselves that it is part of God's confidence building in us to see that he does fulfill his promises. And when he fulfills his promises, well, we can be assured that he will continue to fulfill his promises. So David and the kingdom of Israel, arriving, at a place where no enemy can now defeat David. Every enemy that comes upon David is defeated. And it is the Lord who is giving these defeats to David, and saying, there you go, there's another, but it is definitely part of our makeup to be longing for a kingdom like we found in the garden in chapter 3 of Genesis. That really kind of neat place where everything's kind of clicking and jiving and doing well, and where people are actually in a personal engagement relationship with God. That cannot leave our brain whenever we come to this text, because we say, as good as this is, it isn't the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey might say. So anyhow, in chapter 8, verse 3 to 12, we do get this sense that every knee will bow, and that the wealth of the nations is going to come to God's nation. We also see that Isaiah, in his chapter 60, and Haggai, in his chapter 2, and even Revelation in chapter 21, reinforce this concept that there is a time that when the wealth of the nations will actually be brought voluntarily to God, because they will see who is actually in control. And so we see a small bit of that going on with David. We see a small bit of that, but it's not what we really, really want. What we really, really want is, basically what we are told in verse 15, justice and equity for all. Because as David reigned over Israel, in verse 15, as David reigned over Israel, David administered justice and equity to all his people. Does that sound familiar? Equity and justice for all? Does that sound like liberty and justice for all? It should. Because the heart of God's nation, is actually the individual. The heart of God is actually the individual, not the group. The group is important, for sure. But the individual, this is where the Bible is extraordinary. This is where the Bible is phenomenal. It is unique in its setting, that it emphasizes the proper perspective of a government is to honor the individual, to provide justice and equity, justice and liberty. Is there can you have equity without liberty? And can you have liberty without equity? The answer is no, but I'll let you think about that yourself. When I taught 8th grade history, I always brought that point to, students, that the Declaration of Independence, it's four ideals. The first two are equality and, inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is God coming through the text. The heart of God's nation is the individual receiving justice and equity. The heart of a government, from God's point of view, is a government that serves the individual by providing the individual with true justice and equity. That the government is a servant to the people, not ruling over the people. The government's job is just simply to provide equity and justice. Okay, so anyhow, this is good stuff, because we can actually see the principles at stake in our own country here. That, the highlight reel of David and his kingdom is actually that he administers justice and equity to all his people. And that is the climax. And what we're going to see as the pages unfold is a deterioration of this climax. And as the deterioration happens throughout the pages of the rest of the old part of the Bible, we are going to find ourselves longing like Israel for the real fulfillment of this promise. And so the real fulfillment of this promise is yet to come. That indeed, God still intends to blow the kingdoms, to kingdom come. That in the ultimate finality, Psalm 2 is what God is doing in this world. That one day, a son of David would be recognized by every nation, and that every knee would bow to the Son of David, that God has given the kingdom, the forever kingdom to. And, spoiler alert, we know the answer to that if you're a Christian, and that is Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ, he did inaugurate the kingdom of God by shedding blood, but nobody's but his own. And the reason why he shed his own blood was to establish peace and forgiveness and to open the floodgates of welcomeness to those who are willing to admit we're idiots without God. And that is the story that unfolds. The servant government will be ultimately embodied in the greatest servant of humankind, and that is Jesus Christ, who is God himself. And God himself is the ultimate servant who looks upon the individual and longs for equity and justice to be given to every individual. Individuality is not the substance of any government on earth. In fact, even the United States, who has some of the greatest documents to construct a government, fails at this all the time. And we know it and we can see it. But we know the principles and we know the ideals, and that's what we try to stick to. So liberty and justice for all is what Jesus Christ promises us and what Jesus Christ makes in us in all nations in this world. And as this world continues to groan and long, and as God continues to allow mankind to create its own nations, we are reminded that there is a kingdom that is going to blow all the kingdoms to come. You know that little phrase, blown to kingdom come? It's a Christian phrase. It's a biblical phrase because everything gets blown clear to the coming of God's kingdom, and nothing can blow that kingdom up. That's the promise of God. And David himself is a high point because it's better than the time of the judges. Yeah. Huge contrast here to the time of the judges where people were just doing what is right in their own eyes, But we can see that there is still yet something to come. And as Christians, we now know how the story eventually makes its way to the true Son of David, Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ makes it very clear that the kingdom of God is near because he is there and because he is the kingdom. So he is the kingdom, and when he returns, he will bring the kingdom here on earth. And, ladies and gentlemen, every knee will bow. So I say, why not bow now? Why not be like our good buddy Toy, king of Hamath here, who's just hears David and the greatness of God and what God is doing, and say, I'm in right now, baby. I am in right now. And when you jump into the game and say, I'm in right now, I'm a Jesus freak. He is the true ruler of the world. Nobody's like Jesus Christ. Nobody has the promises of Jesus Christ. And even this passage gives us the assurance that God fulfilled his promise to Abraham here, but yet there is more to come. And so that's what we look forward to, the more to come, when God's kingdom will blow all the kingdoms to come. Well, we'll end our story right there. Catch you next time.